Hello, mystery lovers. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a great day. And tell me, are you ready to step into a chilling winter mystery tonight? Let me ask you something. What if a deadly snowstorm trapped you inside an ancient manor with people you barely trust? What if old family secrets, buried for generations, suddenly began to surface? And what if someone inside the house was quietly testing poison, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Today's story takes us to a remote country estate, locked in by a brutal blizzard, where tensions rise, shadows move in the hallways, and a hidden past threatens to destroy everyone inside. With no escape and no outside help, every whisper could be a warning, and every smile could hide danger. So settle in, stay warm, and let's uncover the mystery buried beneath the snow. Chapter 1. Arrival in the Blizzard. The train rattled to a halt at the tiny rural station of Winterbourne St. Mary, just as the first heavy flakes began to fall. Miss Jane Marple stepped down onto the platform, with the neat precision of a woman who had travelled alone many times before. She was dressed in her usual tweed coat, sensible woolen gloves, and a small black hat pinned firmly in place despite the rising wind. In one hand she carried a modest suitcase, in the other a sturdy umbrella that served more as a walking stick than protection against rain. A single porter emerged from the station house, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "Miss Marple, ma'am, for Eldridge Manor." "Yes, that is correct," she replied pleasantly. "Though I fear the weather is turning rather disagreeable." The porter glanced at the darkening sky. "Aye, they're saying it'll be the worst storm in 20 years. Roads'll be blocked by nightfall. Cars waiting, though. Mr. Hargrove sent his own chauffeur." Miss Marple thanked him and allowed herself to be led to a waiting Daimler, its engine idling softly. The chauffeur, a taciturn man named Bates, touched his cap and took her suitcase without a word. As they pulled away from the station, the snow thickened, swirling across the windscreen in great white sheets. The drive to Eldridge Manor took nearly 40 minutes, winding through narrow lanes already whitening under the onslaught. Bare hedgerows loomed like pale skeletons on either side. Miss Marple watched the landscape disappear behind a veil of snow, and reflected, not for the first time, on the curious circumstances that had brought her here. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. A polite, handwritten note from Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, widow of the late Sir Reginald Hargrove, and now mistress of Eldridge Manor. They had met only once, years ago, at a charity fete in St. Mary Mead, yet Mrs. Hargrove had remembered her kindly. "My family is gathering for Christmas," the letter read, "and I find myself in need of a sympathetic ear. Do say you will come." Miss Marple had hesitated. Christmas was usually spent quietly in her own village. But there had been something in the tone of the letter, an undercurrent of anxiety, that reminded her of other letters she had received over the years. Letters that began with polite pleasantries and ended in murder. The car turned between tall stone gateposts and began the long ascent up a drive flanked by ancient oaks. At last the manor itself came into view. A sprawling Elizabethan pile of dark red brick, its chimneys already smoking against the cold sky. Lights glowed warmly from the mullioned windows, promising shelter. Bates brought the car to a halt before the front steps. Almost immediately, the great oak door opened and a butler appeared, tall, thin, and impeccably correct. "Miss Marple, welcome to Eldridge Manor. I am Carver. Madam is expecting you." Miss Marple stepped inside, shaking snow from her coat. The entrance hall was magnificent, a vaulted space with a hammer-beam roof, suits of armour standing sentinel along the walls, and a huge log fire blazing in an inglenook fireplace. The air smelled of beeswax, evergreen boughs, and something faintly medicinal. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove hurried forward to greet her. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, elegantly dressed in deep green velvet, though her face bore lines of recent strain. "My dear Miss Marple, how good of you to come in this dreadful weather." She clasped both of Miss Marple's hands warmly. "We were afraid the train might be cancelled." "I nearly didn't make it," Miss Marple admitted with a small smile. "But here I am and very grateful for your hospitality. Come through to the drawing room. Everyone is gathered there. We'll have tea before you go up to change." She led Miss Marple across the flagstoned hall and through a heavy door into a long panelled room overlooking the snow-covered gardens. A Christmas tree stood in one corner, its candles unlit. Several people turned to look as they entered. First to rise was a tall young man in his late 20s, fair-haired and rather too handsome. "Aunt Eleanor, is this the famous Miss Marple?" "This is she," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Miss Marple, my nephew, Captain Richard Denning, late of the Guards." Richard Denning bowed with military correctness. "Delighted, ma'am. Aunt has spoken of you often." Next came a dark-haired woman of about 35, strikingly beautiful in a rather theatrical way, wearing a scarlet dress that seemed almost defiant against the winter gloom. "And this is my niece by marriage, Lydia Denning, Richard's wife." Lydia extended a languid hand glittering with rings. "How do you do? We're all simply dying of boredom here. Perhaps you'll enliven us." Miss Marple murmured something polite. A stout, red-faced man in tweeds heaved himself from an armchair by the fire. "George Bantry, cousin," he announced brusquely. "Live on the estate, manage the farms. Damned awful weather for the stock." His wife, a faded blonde woman named Diana, gave Miss Marple a nervous smile from the sofa. Finally, a thin young woman in spectacles detached herself from the shadows near the window. She wore a plain grey dress and carried a book. "I'm Miss Gregory, Mrs. Hargrove's secretary," she said quietly. Tea was brought in by a parlour-maid, and conversation flowed in the desultory way of people thrown together by family obligation. Miss Marple sipped her tea and observed. Mrs. Hargrove spoke of the manor's history. Built in 1587, home to the family ever since. Richard joked about being the poor relation waiting for his inheritance. Lydia complained prettily about the isolation. George Bantry grumbled about falling land values. Diana Bantry said very little. Miss Gregory poured second cups with silent efficiency. Outside, the snow fell thicker than ever. By the time tea was finished, the windows showed nothing but a moving white curtain. Mrs. Hargrove rose. "Carver will show you to your room, Miss Marple. We dine at 8. Nothing formal, just ourselves." The bedroom allocated to her was in the east wing, a spacious chamber with a four-poster bed, heavy brocade curtains, and another roaring fire. From the window, she could see nothing but swirling snow. The isolation was complete. As she unpacked her few things, Miss Marple's mind returned to the drawing-room scene. Something had been wrong. Nothing overt, but a tension beneath the surface, like a wire drawn too tight. Richard had been watchful of his aunt. Lydia's gaiety had seemed forced. George Bantry had drunk 3 cups of tea with rather too much enthusiasm. And Miss Gregory, Why had the secretary's hands trembled when passing the sugar? A gong sounded faintly through the corridors. Dinner in half an hour. Miss Marple closed her suitcase and sat for a moment by the fire. Outside, the wind began to howl around the eaves of Eldridge Manor, and the snow continued to fall as though it would never stop. She had seen gatherings like this before. Families shut away together, old resentments simmering, money worries pressing close. And now the weather had made them prisoners in their own home. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. It was, she reflected, exactly the sort of situation in which things tended to happen. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. Dinner at Eldridge Manor was served in the long oak-panelled dining room, its walls hung with portraits of long-dead Hargroves in varying degrees of severity. A chandelier of Waterford crystal cast a warm but slightly wavering light over the mahogany table, where silver and old china gleamed. Outside, the storm had settled into a steady, relentless fall of snow. The windows were already half obscured by drifting white. Miss Marple took her place between Mrs. Hargrove and Miss Gregory, noting with quiet approval that the seating had been carefully arranged to separate certain family members. Richard Denning sat at one end, carving a saddle of mutton with military precision. His wife Lydia faced him at the far end, toying with her food and drinking rather more claret than was strictly necessary. George Bantry, redder in the face than ever, helped himself liberally to everything within reach, while his wife Diana picked at a small portion and kept her eyes on her plate. Conversation began with the weather, an inevitable topic when English people are trapped together, but soon drifted, as Mrs. Hargrove evidently intended, to the history of the house itself. "This dining room hasn't changed since my husband's grandfather's day," she said, gesturing with a slender hand. "The table is Jacobean, and those portraits, well, they've watched generations come and go." Richard looked up from his carving. "Including Great-Uncle Ambrose, who stares down as though he still disapproves of the modern world." Lydia gave a light laugh that tinkled like breaking glass. "He certainly disapproves of me, darling. I always feel his eyes following me when I pass him on the stairs." "Ambrose Hargrove was a hard man," George Bantry said through a mouthful of mutton. "Made the family fortune in the colonies. Sugar plantations, you know. Came back rich but solitary. Never married." Miss Marple, who had been listening with her usual mild attention, murmured, "I believe I read something of him once. There was a scandal, was there not? Something about a missing heir." Mrs. Hargrove's fork paused halfway to her lips. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to still. Then George Bantry gave a loud guffaw. "Scandal! That's putting it mildly. Old Ambrose had a son, born on the wrong side of the blanket, of course. Brought the boy back from Jamaica when he was about 10, called him Edward. Intended to leave him everything, or so the story went. But the boy vanished one winter's night in 1892, never seen again." Diana Bantry gave a little shiver. "How dreadful! They say his ghost walks the west corridor." "Nonsense," Richard said briskly. "The boy probably ran off to sea, common enough in those days." But Miss Gregory, pushing her spectacles up her nose, spoke quietly. "Actually, there are letters in the muniment room that suggest otherwise. Ambrose was convinced the child had been removed." "Removed," Lydia echoed, arching a perfectly plucked eyebrow. "You mean murdered? How deliciously Gothic." Mrs. Hargrove set down her glass with a small click. "Let us not dwell on unpleasant old tales. Ambrose died intestate in the end, and the estate passed to his nephew, my husband's father. All perfectly legal. Yet Miss Marple noticed that her hostess's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the decanter, and Richard's jaw had tightened. He was staring at the portrait of Ambrose Hargrove, a stern-faced man in his 60s with cold grey eyes, as though challenging it. The second course was served. A pheasant in rich sauce, accompanied by winter vegetables from the estate's greenhouses. Conversation turned to lighter matters, the difficulty of obtaining decent domestic staff, the rising cost of coal. But the earlier topic had left a residue, like smoke after a fire. After the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the men to their port, Miss Marple found herself seated near the great fireplace beside Diana Bantry. The younger woman was twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "These old houses," Diana said in a low voice, "they hold on to things, don't they? Secrets, I mean. Sometimes I feel as though the walls are listening." Miss Marple knitted placidly, her needles clicking. "Houses often remember what people would prefer to forget, my dear, but memories are not always accurate." Diana glanced toward the door, as if fearing interruption. "George says I imagine things, but lately there have been letters, anonymous ones, saying dreadful things about the family, about money that doesn't belong to us." Miss Marple's needles did not pause. "Anonymous letters are usually written by someone who feels themselves wronged or afraid." Across the room, Lydia was playing something restless on the grand piano, Chopin perhaps, while Mrs. Hargrove and Miss Gregory spoke in undertones about household accounts. The snow tapped insistently against the tall windows. When the men rejoined them, George Bantry was louder than before, his face flushed with port. He launched into a story about poachers on the estate, but Miss Marple noticed that Richard kept glancing toward the long windows, as though expecting something or someone to appear out of the whiteness beyond. Coffee was served, and then Mrs. Hargrove suggested that given the lateness of the hour and the severity of the storm, an early night might be wise. The telephone lines, Carver informed them quietly, had gone down sometime during dinner. They were now completely cut off. As the party dispersed along dimly lit corridors, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Miss Gregory, who carried a candle since the electric lighting in the upper floors was prone to flickering in bad weather. "You mentioned letters in the muniment room," Miss Marple said gently. "About the missing boy." Miss Gregory hesitated. "Yes, I've been cataloguing the family papers for Mrs. Hargrove. There are several from Ambrose to his solicitor, expressing fear that certain persons wish to prevent Edward inheriting, but the solicitor's replies are missing." "And the boy himself, what was he like?" "From the one photograph I found, he was dark-skinned. His mother was Jamaican, you see. Very handsome child. There's a miniature of him somewhere, painted when he was about 12. They reached Miss Marple's door. The secretary lowered her voice further. "There's something else. A few weeks ago, someone broke into the muniment room. Nothing was taken, but papers had been disturbed, specifically the bundle relating to Edward Hargrove." Miss Marple thanked her and wished her good night. Once inside her room, she lit the bedside lamp and sat for some time in thought. The missing heir of 1892 was, of course, long dead, whether by misadventure, murder, or flight. Yet the story had clearly stirred uncomfortable echoes in the present company. Richard's tension, Lydia's forced gaiety, George's over-hearty manner, Diana's nervousness, and Mrs. Hargrove's carefully maintained composure all suggested that the past was not as buried as it ought to be. From her window, she could see nothing but swirling snow, but she fancied she heard, faint beneath the wind's howl, another sound, the creaking of old timbers, as though the house itself were shifting in its sleep. Miss Marple drew the heavy curtains closed and prepared for bed, but before extinguishing the lamp, she took from her handbag a small notebook and wrote in her neat, precise hand, "Questions arising. Who benefits most if old scandals are revived? Why the recent interest in Edward Hargrove's papers? Anonymous letters. Source?" She underlined the last item twice. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and silent, erasing footprints, covering paths, sealing Eldridge Manor in a white cocoon. And somewhere in the darkened corridors below, someone, who knew exactly what ghosts had been awakened that night, was listening to the house settle around them. Chapter 3. The Shadow in the Hallway. Miss Marple was not a heavy sleeper. Years of living alone in a quiet village cottage had trained her to notice the smallest disturbances. The creak of a floorboard, the faint click of a latch, the hush of a door closing too carefully. So when, some time after midnight, she heard footsteps passing slowly along the corridor outside her room, she was instantly awake. She lay still for a moment, listening. The footsteps were soft, so soft that an ordinary sleeper would have dismissed them as the house settling. But they had a deliberate rhythm, pausing now and then as though the walker were listening in turn. They came from the direction of the main staircase, moved past her door, and continued toward the west wing. Miss Marple slipped out of bed, drew on her dressing gown, and lit the small bedside candle. The room was bitterly cold, the fire had burned low, and frost was already feathering the inside of the window panes. She opened her door a cautious inch. The corridor was empty, lit only by a single wall sconce that flickered in the draught. At the far end, where the passage turned toward the older part of the house, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a darker shape against the darkness, before it vanished around the corner. She hesitated. Prudence suggested returning to bed. Curiosity, that lifelong companion, urged her forward. Curiosity won. Candle in hand, she stepped into the corridor, her sensible slippers making no sound on the thick turkey carpet. The air smelled of old wood and candle smoke. As she moved toward the west wing, she noted small things. A faint scuff mark on the polished floor, as though someone had dragged a heel. A door to one of the guest rooms standing slightly ajar, when she was certain it had been closed earlier. She paused outside Richard and Lydia Denning's room. No light showed beneath the door, but she heard the low murmur of voices. Richard's clipped tones, Lydia's lighter, more agitated ones. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm suggested an argument. Miss Marple passed on. At the turn of the corridor, she found a narrow flight of servants' stairs leading upward. A cold draught breathed down them, carrying with it the smell of damp stone. Someone had come this way recently. The dust on the handrail was disturbed. She did not follow. Instead, she continued to the west wing, where the missing boy, Edward Hargrove, was said to haunt the passages. Here the decor was older. Panelling darkened with age, a threadbare runner on the floor, portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her progress. Halfway along, she stopped. One of the doors, leading, she believed, to a disused nursery, stood open several inches. A faint light glimmered within. Miss Marple approached silently and peered through the gap. The room was empty, but a candle had been set on a dusty table, its flame guttering in the draught. Beside it lay an object that caught her attention immediately. A small leather-bound book, open at a page marked with a ribbon. Even from the doorway she could see that it was a journal or diary, the handwriting small and precise. Before she could decide whether to enter, a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned swiftly, raising her candle. Nothing. Only the long, empty corridor stretching back the way she had come. But the nursery door, which had been ajar, was now closed. Someone had been watching her. Miss Marple returned to her room with quiet haste, locking the door behind her, a precaution she rarely took. She added a new entry to her notebook: midnight prowler, west wing, diary left in nursery, deliberately. Argument in Dennings's room, footprints on back stairs. She underlined deliberately twice. The following morning broke grey and silent. Snow had piled against the lower windows during the night, and the world outside was a featureless white expanse. Carver informed the household at breakfast that the drive was impassable. The telephone remained dead. They were effectively imprisoned until the thaw. The news was received with varying degrees of equanimity. George Bantry swore about stranded livestock. Lydia declared herself delighted, like being in an Agatha Christie novel. While Richard merely looked grim, Mrs. Hargrove preserved her calm, but Miss Marple noticed that her hostess's eyes kept straying toward the west windows. After breakfast, small disturbances began to be reported. Diana Bantry claimed that someone had moved her jewellery box during the night. Nothing was missing, but the items inside had been rearranged. Miss Gregory discovered that the papers in the muniment room, which she had left neatly stacked, were now in disarray. Though again, nothing appeared to have been taken. Most troubling of all, when Carver went to check the West Wing nursery, prompted by a quiet word from Miss Marple, he found the door locked from the inside. When it was eventually forced, the room was empty, the candle burned down to a stub, and the diary gone. Richard Denning, who had assisted with the door, examined the windows. "Locked and bolted," he reported. "No footprints in the snow below. Whoever was in here last night didn't leave by the obvious route." Lydia gave a theatrical shudder. Then they must still be in the house. How perfectly horrid! Mrs. Hargrove suggested that it was probably one of the servants playing a foolish prank, but her voice lacked conviction. Throughout the day, as the snow continued to fall in a thick muffling curtain, Miss Marple moved quietly about the house, observing. She noted that George Bantry spent much of the morning in the library with a decanter of whisky, emerging redder than ever. Diana hovered near him, anxious and fluttering. Lydia retired to her room with a headache, while Richard strode restlessly from window to window, as though expecting rescue or pursuit. Miss Gregory worked doggedly at her cataloguing, but her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. In the afternoon, Miss Marple found herself alone in the long gallery that connected the east and west wings. Snowlight filtered through high windows, giving everything a cold, underwater glow. She paused before a portrait of Ambrose Hargrove, the same stern face that hung in the dining room, and studied it thoughtfully. Behind her, a voice said softly, "He was not a kind man, you know." She turned to find Miss Gregory standing a few paces away, a bundle of papers in her arms. "Few rich men are, when their fortunes are threatened," Miss Marple replied mildly, "especially by an illegitimate son." Miss Gregory glanced along the empty gallery. "There are those who believe the boy was murdered to preserve the inheritance, and that the murderer went unpunished." Beliefs are not proofs, my dear. No, but sometimes the past repeats itself. The secretary's voice was barely above a whisper. Some people here fear that old wrongs are about to be righted in ways they cannot control. She hurried away before Miss Marple could question her further. That evening, as the household gathered once more in the drawing-room, the atmosphere was perceptibly strained. Conversation faltered. Eyes avoided eyes. The fire crackled loudly in the silence. Outside, the wind had risen again, driving snow against the windows with a sound like fingers scratching to be let in. Miss Marple sat knitting, her expression serene, but her mind was busy arranging the small, apparently disconnected events of the past 24 hours into patterns. Someone in this house was searching for something. Perhaps the missing diary. Perhaps something more dangerous. Someone else was afraid of being found out. And someone, possibly the same person, had tried to frighten the residents with petty disturbances. But why? She thought of the locked nursery, the vanished diary, the disturbed papers, the midnight footsteps, and she remembered an old saying from her village. When the snow falls deep, it covers old sins, but it also preserves footprints for those who know where to look. The clock struck 9. In the hush that followed, Carver entered bearing a tray of drinks. As he passed behind George Bantry's chair, Miss Marple noticed something. A faint white mark on the butler's dark sleeve, plaster dust perhaps, or snow that had not quite melted. The sort of mark left by someone who had been in a cold, disused upper room very recently. She filed the observation away. The night ahead promised to be long. And somewhere in the darkened corridors of Eldridge Manor, the shadow was moving again. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Chalice. The third day of the snowstorm dawned no brighter than the previous ones. A thick, oppressive grey light filtered through the frosted windows of Eldridge Manor, and the house seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of the drifts outside. By breakfast, it was clear that the isolation would last longer than anyone had hoped. The lanes were buried under 4 feet of snow. The telephone lines remained silent, and even the wireless set in the morning room produced nothing but static. The household gathered in the dining room with the subdued air of people who have begun to feel the strain of confinement. Conversation was sparse. George Bantry complained about the lack of newspapers. Lydia declared that she was positively perishing for want of distraction. Richard stared out at the white wilderness, as though willing a rescue party to appear. Miss Marple, buttering a piece of toast, observed them all with her usual mild interest. She had added several new entries to her notebook during a wakeful night. Carver's sleeve, dust from attic or nursery? Miss Gregory's warning, the past repeats itself. Diana Bantry's fear of anonymous letters. The vanished diary, contents vital? She was turning these points over in her mind when Mrs. Hargrove made an announcement. "I have decided," she said, setting down her coffee cup, "that we shall have a small celebration this evening. It is, after all, the eve of Christmas Eve. We may be cut off from the world, but we need not be entirely barbarous. Carver will serve dinner in the Great Hall, and afterwards we shall have mulled wine by the tree." There was a murmur of surprise, followed by tentative approval. Even Lydia brightened. "How perfectly medieval! Shall we have wassail and mummers?" Mrs. Hargrove smiled thinly. "Mulled wine will suffice." The day passed slowly. Miss Marple spent part of it in the library, ostensibly reading, but actually watching the comings and goings. She noted that Richard spent an hour in the muniment room with Miss Gregory, ostensibly helping her sort papers, though their voices were raised more than once. George Bantry disappeared into the billiard room and emerged only for luncheon, smelling strongly of whisky. Diana followed him about like a nervous spaniel. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple took a turn along the west corridor. The nursery door had been left unlocked since the previous day's forcible entry. She slipped inside. The room was bitterly cold, the candle long since removed. Dust lay thick on the old toys and broken furniture. She examined the windows again, still bolted from the inside, and then the floor near the door. There, almost invisible against the dark boards, was a small white scrape. Plaster or lime, perhaps fallen from someone's shoe. She was on her knees examining it when she heard footsteps approaching. Hastily, she rose and moved behind the half-open door. Miss Gregory entered, carrying a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon. She went straight to an old nursery cupboard, opened it, and placed the bundle inside on the top shelf. Then she stood for a moment, head bowed, as though in thought or prayer. Miss Marple remained silent until the secretary had left. Then she retrieved the bundle. The letters were addressed to my dear Ambrose, in a woman's hand, the ink faded but still legible. They were love letters from Edward Hargrove's Jamaican mother, pleading for recognition for her son. The last one, dated a week before the boy's disappearance, contained a desperate threat. "If you will not acknowledge him openly, I shall come myself and force the truth into the light." Miss Marple returned the letters exactly as she had found them. Dinner that evening was indeed served in the great hall, a vast medieval chamber rarely used except for grand occasions. A long table had been laid beneath the minstrel's gallery, and a huge fire blazed in the stone hearth. Branches of holly and ivy decorated the walls, and the Christmas tree stood at the far end, its candles now lit. The mulled wine was served in an ancient silver chalice that passed from hand to hand, a family tradition, Mrs. Hargrove explained. Each guest was to drink from it in turn, beginning with the hostess. Mrs. Hargrove raised the chalice. "To absent friends," she said quietly, and drank. It passed to Richard, then Lydia, then George Bantry, who took a hearty swallow, then Diana, Miss Gregory, and finally Miss Marple herself. The wine was rich and spicy, warmed with cloves and cinnamon. After the toast, individual glasses were filled from a modern decanter, and the party settled into a slightly forced festivity. Lydia played carols on the piano in the adjoining drawing room. Richard told army stories. George became louder and redder. It was nearly 11 when George Bantry suddenly lurched to his feet. "Feel devilish odd," he muttered, clutching the edge of the table. His face, already florid, had taken on a purplish tinge. "Head spinning, damned wine too strong, what?" Diana gave a small scream. "George, you're ill!" He tried to speak again, but only a guttural sound emerged. Then his knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily to the flagstones, dragging a corner of the tablecloth with him. Glasses shattered. Red wine spread like blood across the floor. Chaos followed. Richard and Carver lifted the unconscious man and carried him to a sofa by the fire. Mrs. Hargrove sent Miss Gregory running for brandy, Diana for hot water bottles. Miss Marple knelt beside George, feeling for his pulse, rapid and thready, and noting the dilation of his pupils. "Poison," she said quietly to Richard, who was loosening his cousin's collar. "Almost certainly. We must get a doctor, but in this weather." Richard's face was grim. "Impossible! We're snowed in for days yet." George stirred and groaned. His breathing was laboured, but he was not dead, nor, Miss Marple judged, likely to die immediately. Whatever had been administered had been meant to alarm rather than kill outright. Carver fetched blankets. Diana hovered, weeping. Lydia stood apart, very pale, twisting her rings. Mrs. Hargrove, white to the lips, addressed the room. "This is monstrous. Someone in this house—" She could not finish. Miss Marple rose. "We must be calm. Mr. Bantry needs quiet and warmth. Miss Gregory, perhaps you would sit with Mrs. Bantry and keep watch. Captain Denning, may I speak with you and Mrs. Hargrove privately?" They withdrew to the library, leaving the others in the hall. The fire there had burned low. Snow tapped insistently at the windows. Miss Marple spoke first. The poison was in the mulled wine. Everyone drank from the chalice, yet only Mr. Bantry was affected severely. The rest of us felt nothing beyond the usual warmth. Richard frowned. Then the dose must have been added to his individual glass afterwards. Or, Miss Marple said gently, to something he alone consumed in quantity. I noticed that Mr. Bantry took rather more than his share of the spiced nuts that were passed with the wine. They were in a silver dish directly in front of him. Mrs. Hargrove sank into a chair. "You mean the poison was in the nuts?" "It seems likely. A crystalline substance, monkshood perhaps, or something similar, could have been sprinkled on a handful. The taste would be masked by the spices." Richard paced. "But who—" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we must discover before there is a second attempt. For I fear this was not meant to kill, but to warn or to test." Mrs. Hargrove looked at her sharply. "Test? To see how much poison would be needed for a fatal dose," Miss Marple finished quietly. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind howling around the eaves. Back in the hall, George Bantry had been carried to his room. The household dispersed to their beds under a pall of shock and suspicion. Doors were locked. Whispers followed Miss Marple along the corridors. In her own room, she added to her notebook, "Poisoned nuts, intended for George Bantry alone. Why George?" "He knows something or fears something. The letters in the nursery cupboard, someone wishes them hidden. Connection to Edward Hargrove?" She paused, then wrote one final line. "Tomorrow someone will try again, unless we prevent it." Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, deeper than ever, sealing the manor in a white tomb. And in the darkness below, footsteps once more moved softly along the west corridor, toward the nursery, or perhaps toward a more dangerous errand. Chapter 5. Echoes from the attic. Christmas Eve arrived without ceremony. A thin, iron-grey light seeped through the snow-plastered windows of Eldridge Manor, and the house felt colder than ever. George Bantry, though weak and confined to his bed, had survived the night. The poison, identified by Miss Marple as aconitine derived from monkshood, had been administered in too small a quantity to kill a man of his robust constitution outright. He was irritable, demanding brandy, and refusing to believe that anyone had tried to harm him. "It was bad nuts," he insisted hoarsely to anyone who would listen. "Damned cook left them too long in the store." No one contradicted him openly, but suspicion hung in the air like frost. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly. She took tea with Mrs. Hargrove in the morning room, noting how her hostess's hands trembled as she poured. "You believe this was deliberate," Mrs. Hargrove said at last, her voice low, "and aimed at George?" "I fear so," Miss Marple replied. "Mr. Bantry is not a popular man, perhaps, but more importantly, he is the only one here with detailed knowledge of the estate's finances. If he were to die suddenly, certain questions might remain unasked." Mrs. Hargrove paled. "You think this is about money?" "Most things are, my dear, or about what money represents, power, security, legacy." After leaving her hostess, Miss Marple made her way to the upper floors. The previous night's wind had died away, leaving an eerie stillness. Snow had drifted so high against the attic windows that only a dim glow penetrated. She had a purpose. The plaster dust on Carver's sleeve, the scrape on the nursery floor, the vanished diary, all pointed upward. Someone had been using the disused attics as a hiding place or a route between wings. The main attic door was at the end of the west corridor, secured by a padlock that looked new. But Miss Marple, who had spent many years observing village handymen, knew that new padlocks often replaced old ones for a reason. She tried the handle gently. Locked, as expected. However, a narrow servants' staircase continued upward beyond the landing. Its door was merely latched. She lifted the latch and climbed. The attic stretched the full length of the manor, a cavernous space divided by brick chimneys and cluttered with centuries of discarded furniture, trunks and rolled carpets. Snow sifted softly through gaps in the slates overhead, and her candle threw long, wavering shadows. She moved carefully, noting fresh disturbances in the thick dust. A clear set of footprints, men's shoes, size 10 or 11, leading toward the far end where the roof sloped lowest. Following them, she passed a stack of old portraits, their faces blackened with soot, and a child's rocking horse, whose painted eyes gleamed unnaturally in the gloom. At last she reached a small cleared space beneath a dormer window. Here the footprints ended. On the floor lay a leather-bound diary, smaller than she had expected, its cover cracked with age. Beside it was a modern manila folder containing typed sheets and several photographs. A candle stub and a box of matches had been left on an upturned crate, suggesting recent occupation. Miss Marple sat on the crate and opened the diary first. The handwriting was a child's, large careful letters, dated 1891, 1892. It belonged to Edward Hargrove. The entries were poignant in their simplicity. Lessons with a tutor, riding his pony, missing his mother in Jamaica. Then, toward the end, a change. Fear. Uncle Ambrose is angry again. He says I must not speak of Mamma to visitors. Cousin Reginald watches me always. I heard him tell Uncle that the boy is a threat. I wish Mamma would come. The final entry, dated 3 days before the disappearance. They argue at night. I hide in the attic. If something happens to me, this book will tell the truth. Miss Marple closed the diary gently and turned to the folder. The typed sheets were a draft of a legal document, a claim to the Hargrove estate on behalf of a living descendant of Edward Hargrove. The claimant's name was redacted, but supporting evidence included birth certificates, a marriage record from Jamaica, and DNA comparison results linking the claimant to a lock of hair preserved from the boy Edward. The photographs showed a middle-aged man of mixed race, handsome, serious, standing before a modest house in the Caribbean. On the back of one was written, in Miss Gregory's neat hand, Mr. E. Hargrove, great-grandson. Miss Marple sat very still, piecing it together. Edward had not died in 1892. He had been smuggled out, perhaps by his mother, perhaps by a sympathetic servant, and raised abroad. His descendants had waited until now, until DNA evidence made denial impossible, to press their claim. And someone in this house knew. The attic floor creaked behind her. She turned calmly. Richard Denning stood in the dormer opening, a torch in one hand, his face unreadable in the half-light. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I thought I heard someone up here." I followed footprints, she replied, undisturbed, as I suspect you have done before. He stepped closer, eyes on the diary and folder. You've found it, then? Yes. A most interesting document. It explains a great deal. The disturbances, the poison, the interest in old papers. Richard's jaw tightened. The claim is fraudulent. Some adventurer trying to blackmail Aunt Eleanor. DNA is difficult to falsify, Captain Denning, and the diary is certainly genuine. He was silent for a moment. Then George knew about this. He's been handling the estate accounts for years. He told me last month that a solicitor had approached him quietly, with questions about the succession. George laughed it off, said he'd bury it. But then the letters started arriving, anonymous, threatening to go public unless a settlement was made. Miss Marple nodded. So the poison was meant to silence him before he could reveal what he knew, or perhaps to force a confession. Richard looked suddenly weary. I don't know who tried to kill him. I only know that if this claim succeeds, the estate is ruined. Aunt Eleanor would lose everything. And Lydia, he broke off. And you, Miss Marple prompted gently. I'm the heir presumptive. Or was. He gave a short, bitter laugh. Without the estate, I'm nothing. Debts, you see. Rather a lot of them. Footsteps sounded below. Light, hurried. Miss Gregory appeared at the attic entrance, breathless. Captain Richard, Miss Marple, Mrs. Hargrove is asking for you both. Mr. Bantry is worse. He's been sick again, and there's talk of arsenic this time. Richard swore under his breath. Miss Marple gathered the diary and folder carefully. We had better go down, she said, but these will come with me. They descended together, the attic door closing behind them with a soft, final click. In the corridor below, the house seemed to listen. Somewhere a clock struck noon, muffled by snow. As they hurried toward the east wing, Miss Marple's mind raced. 2 attempts on George Bantry's life. First aconitine, now perhaps arsenic. The poisoner was escalating, and the motive was clear. To prevent George from either suppressing or revealing the truth about the true heir. But who had access to both poisons? Monkshood grew wild in the estate's woods. Arsenic was kept in the gardener's shed for rat control. Almost anyone. In George Bantry's bedroom, they found chaos. Diana knelt by the bed, sobbing. Mrs. Hargrove stood pale but composed. A tray with breakfast remnants, porridge, toast, a pot of tea, had been overturned in the struggle to help him. George lay propped on pillows, sweating and retching, but conscious. Someone, in my tea, he gasped, tasted bitter. Miss Marple examined the spilled cup. A faint metallic odour confirmed her suspicion. Richard turned on the room at large. Who brought Mr. Bantry's tray this morning? Carver stepped forward. I did, sir, but it was prepared by cook, and I carried it straight up. And who was in the kitchen? Cook, the parlour-maid, the boot-boy, all vouched for one another. No stranger had entered. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at Diana Bantry, who was clutching her husband's hand and weeping. My dear, she said gently, did you add anything to the tea? Sugar, perhaps? Or milk from your own jug? Diana looked up, startled. I poured the tea for him. He likes it sweet. I added 3 lumps, as always. And the sugar bowl? It was on the tray. Miss Marple lifted the small silver bowl from the debris. A thin white powder clung to the bottom beneath the cubes. Odourless, deadly. Diana gasped. I didn't, I swear. Of course you didn't know, Miss Marple said kindly. But someone who knew your husband's habits very well did. The room fell silent. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, heavier, faster, as though determined to bury the manor and all its secrets forever. But Miss Marple knew that secrets, like footprints in snow, could be covered only for a time. And time, she reflected, was running out. Chapter 6. The Midnight Confession. The clock in the great hall struck midnight on Christmas Eve, its deep chimes echoing through the silent house like a funeral bell. Snow had ceased to fall at last, leaving Eldridge Manor entombed in a profound, glittering hush. Every window was blinded by drifts, every door sealed by ice. No help could reach them, and none could leave. Miss Marple sat in the library, the diary and legal folder open on the table before her. A single lamp burned, throwing a small circle of light onto the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. She had asked for privacy, and the household, shocked by the second attempt on George Bantry's life, had granted it without protest. George himself was sleeping fitfully under laudanum administered by Mrs. Hargrove, who had once trained as a nurse. Diana sat beside him, red-eyed and silent. The others had retired early, doors locked, nerves frayed to breaking. Yet Miss Marple knew that someone would come. She did not have long to wait. The library door opened softly, and Miss Gregory entered, closing it behind her with care. She wore a dark dressing gown, her hair down for once, making her look younger and more vulnerable. In her hand, she carried a small envelope. "I thought you would still be awake," she said quietly. "I frequently am, when there are puzzles to solve." Miss Marple indicated the chair opposite. "Sit down, my dear. You have something to tell me." Miss Gregory sat, but on the edge of the seat, as though ready for flight. She placed the envelope on the table. "This arrived 2 days before the snow began. Slipped under my door, no postmark. I think it is time you saw it." Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cheap paper, the message typed, "The true heir knows what was done to his great-grandfather. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Pay $50,000 by New Year, or the truth goes to the newspapers and the police." There was no signature. "Blackmail," Miss Marple murmured. "And you have received others?" Miss Gregory nodded. "3 in all. Increasingly threatening. The last one said that if the money was not paid, someone here would pay with their life. Beginning with Mr. Bantry. Yes, George has been difficult. He discovered my research into Edward Hargrove's fate months ago. He threatened to dismiss me unless I stopped. Then the claimant contacted Mrs. Hargrove directly. George advised her to ignore it, said it was a confidence trick, but I believe it is genuine." Miss Marple tapped the legal folder. "The DNA evidence appears conclusive, and the diary corroborates the story of threat and concealment." Miss Gregory's voice shook. "Edward didn't die. He was smuggled to Scotland by a loyal maid, then to Jamaica. His mother had arranged it. The family pretended he had vanished to avoid scandal, and to secure the inheritance for Reginald Hargrove, Sir Reginald's father. Who else knows the full truth? Mrs. Hargrove suspects. Richard certainly does. He found my notes last month. Lydia overheard an argument. George knew enough to be dangerous. And Diana," she hesitated, "Diana has been stealing small things for years to pay gambling debts. George covered for her, but only if she spied for him." Miss Marple leaned back, so almost everyone had a motive either to suppress or expose the claim. But only one person has tried to kill. Miss Gregory met her eyes steadily. "I think I know who it is." Before she could say more, the door opened again, this time without ceremony. Richard Denning entered, fully dressed, his face set and pale. "I saw your light," he said. "We need to talk, all of us." He was followed almost immediately by Lydia, wrapped in a fur-trimmed negligee, and then by Miss Hargrove herself, carrying a candle. Within minutes they were all assembled. The 5 survivors of the inner circle, seated around the library table like reluctant conspirators. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Richard spoke first. "This can't go on. 2 attempts on George's life. We're trapped here together, and one of us is a poisoner. Better to have it out now." Lydia gave a brittle laugh. "How dramatic, darling. Shall we each confess in turn?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut across her. "Enough, Lydia. Miss Marple has found certain documents in the attic. I think we must hear what she has to say." All eyes turned to Miss Marple. She spoke calmly, laying the diary and folder on the table. Edward Hargrove was not murdered in 1892. He was removed for his own safety because his life was in danger from members of this family who wished to secure the estate. His descendants have waited until modern science could prove their claim. That proof now exists. Richard's fists clenched. And if it succeeds, the estate is bankrupt. Debts, death duties, everything gone. Mrs. Hargrove said quietly, "I have already instructed my solicitor to negotiate a settlement. A portion of the unentailed land will be sold. The manor itself will remain mine for my lifetime." Lydia stared. "You knew?" "I suspected. Miss Gregory's research confirmed it. The blackmail letters forced my hand." Richard stood abruptly. "Then why the attempts on George? He was the only one who wanted to fight the claim." "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "George Bantry was not trying to fight the claim. He was trying to profit from it." Silence fell. Miss Gregory spoke into it. "George approached the claimant privately. He offered to destroy evidence, to testify that the DNA sample was contaminated, in return for a substantial payment. The claimant refused. That is when the poisonings began." Richard frowned. "But who?" The door opened once more. Carver stood there, impassive. "Begging your pardon, madam. Mrs. Bantry asks if someone would sit with her. Mr. Bantry is awake and talking." They went upstairs in a body. George Bantry lay propped against pillows, his face grey but his eyes sharp. Diana was not in the room. She had, Carver said, gone to fetch fresh water. George's voice was a harsh whisper. "Time. To confess. Can't let it go on." He looked at Richard. "Sorry, old boy. Needed money. Debts. Diana's mostly. Thought if I scared the claimant off, or framed someone else for tampering with evidence." Mrs. Hargrove said coldly, "You poisoned yourself." "First time. Yes. Small dose. Monk's hood from the woods. Meant to look like an attack on me. To cast suspicion on the claimant's supporters here. But the second time..." He coughed rackingly. "Second time was real. Someone else finished what I started." "Who?" Richard demanded. George's eyes closed. "Don't know, but the arsenic was in the sugar. Diana always sweetens my tea. She must have..." He drifted into unconsciousness. Diana was found 10 minutes later in the West Wing nursery, the door locked from the inside. When Richard broke it down, she was sitting in the old rocking chair, an empty bottle of laudanum in her hand. A note lay on the table beside her. "I couldn't let him expose us both. Forgive me, she was dead." The room stared at the scene in stunned silence. Miss Marple was the first to speak. A confession and a misdirection. Diana did not poison the sugar. "How can you be sure?" Lydia whispered. "Because the arsenic was added after the tray left the kitchen. And Diana Bantry was in her room all morning. She never went down until after the tray was brought up. Carver saw her." Mrs. Hargrove turned to the butler. "Is that true?" Carver inclined his head. "Yes, madam." Miss Marple looked at each face in turn. The real poisoner knew George's habits, had access to both monkshood and arsenic, and needed him silenced, not for the inheritance, but to prevent exposure of another crime. She paused. The midnight confession we needed has been given, but not by the guilty party. Outside, the first faint hint of dawn touched the snow-covered roofs. Christmas Day was beginning, but in the hushed bedroom, with Diana's body cooling in the nursery and George hovering between life and death, celebration seemed very far away, and Miss Marple knew that the final act had not yet been played. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Culprit. Christmas morning broke clear and cold. A pale sun glittered on the endless fields of snow, turning the drifts into a blinding sea of white. For the first time in days, the sky was visible, and the silence outside was absolute. Inside Eldridge Manor, however, there was no peace. Diana Bantry's body had been laid in the disused chapel at the end of the west wing, a small cold room that had not been used for worship in 50 years. George Bantry, heavily sedated, had been told only that his wife had taken ill. He slept fitfully, unaware that he was now both widower and prime suspect in the eyes of the household. The remaining residents gathered in the great hall at 11 o'clock, summoned by a note from Miss Marple, delivered by Carver. A fire had been lit, but it did little to dispel the chill that had settled over everyone. Mrs. Hargrove sat in a high-backed Elizabethan chair, upright and pale. Richard stood behind her, one hand on the chair back as though to lend support or to steady himself. Lydia perched on a settle near the window, smoking a cigarette with quick, nervous puffs. Miss Gregory stood apart, hands clasped, spectacles reflecting the firelight so that her eyes were unreadable. Carver closed the double doors with solemn care and took up position beside them. Miss Marple entered last, carrying her notebook and the attic documents. She placed them on a small table that had been set in the centre of the room and looked slowly around the circle of faces. "Thank you for coming," she began quietly. "It is time we brought this unhappy business to an end. A woman lies dead by her own hand, or so it appears. A man has been poisoned twice. Old secrets have been stirred, and new crimes committed. But the snow is melting. Slowly, it is true, but melting nonetheless. Help will reach us soon. Before it does, we must know the truth." Lydia flicked ash into the hearth. "We all know the truth, don't we? Poor Diana couldn't bear the guilt." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear, Diana did not poison her husband. She believed she had, because the note she left said so. But she was mistaken. Someone wished us to believe it." Richard frowned. "But the arsenic was in the sugar bowl on George's tray. Diana admitted she sweetened his tea." "She did," Miss Marple agreed. "But the arsenic was added after the tray left the kitchen and before it reached Mr. Bantry's room. Diana never touched the sugar bowl until she poured the tea. Someone else did." Mrs. Hargrove spoke for the first time. "Who?" Miss Marple opened the diary and the legal folder, laying them side by side. "Let us go back to the beginning. Edward Hargrove did not disappear in 1892 by accident or murder. He was removed for his own safety because his existence threatened the inheritance. His descendants have now proved their claim. That claim would ruin the present family financially. Most of you knew this. Mr. George Bantry saw an opportunity. He attempted to blackmail the claimant privately, offering to discredit the evidence for money. When that failed, he staged the first poisoning on himself with monkshood, intending to cast suspicion on supporters of the claim within the house. He hoped to frighten the claimant into withdrawing. Richard nodded slowly. That much he confessed last night. Yes, but the second poisoning, the arsenic, was genuine and nearly fatal. Someone else wished Mr. Bantry dead, and quickly, before he could reveal who had been helping him. Lydia crushed out her cigarette. Diana, obviously. She knew about his scheme and feared exposure. Miss Marple looked at her compassionately. No, Lydia. Diana knew nothing of the blackmail. She stole small items to pay her own debts, and George covered for her, in return for information about what others in the house were doing. But she was not party to his larger plan. She turned to Miss Gregory. You, my dear, discovered the truth about Edward's survival through your research. You believed the claim just, and you corresponded with the descendant. Miss Gregory inclined her head. I did. I felt it was right that the wrong done in 1892 should be put right now. Quite so, and you hid the crucial letters in the nursery cupboard for safekeeping. Miss Gregory flushed. I feared someone would destroy them. Richard stirred. But none of this explains who tried to kill George the second time. Miss Marple closed the folder. The poisoner needed 3 things: knowledge of poisons, opportunity to administer them, and a motive stronger than money. The first attempt failed to silence George. The second was meant to succeed, and to implicate Diana, whose death would neatly tie up all loose ends. She paused, letting the silence deepen. The monk's hood came from the estate woods. Anyone might have gathered it. But the arsenic came from the gardener's shed, where rat poison is kept under lock. The key hangs in the butler's pantry. All eyes turned involuntarily to Carver, who stood motionless by the door. Miss Marple continued gently. Carver has served this family for 30 years. He is devoted to Mrs. Hargrove, perhaps more than devoted. When he learned of the claim that would strip her of her home, he acted to protect her, first by searching the muniment room and attic for evidence he could destroy. Then, when George Bantry's fake poisoning threatened to bring everything into the open, Carver decided to silence him permanently, and to make it appear that Diana, in despair, had taken her own life after the deed. Carver's face remained impassive, but a faint flush rose in his cheeks. Richard took a step forward. Carver, that's absurd. He's been with us forever. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Loyalty can be a dangerous thing when it becomes obsession. Carver knew every habit in the house. He carried George's breakfast tray himself that morning. He had ample opportunity to add arsenic to the sugar bowl in the pantry. He knew Diana would be blamed. And he knew that her death, apparently by suicide, would convince everyone the matter was closed. Mrs. Hargrove rose slowly. Carver, is this true? The butler looked at her for a long moment. Then his rigid posture seemed to sag. I could not let you lose everything, madam, he said quietly. Not after all these years. Sir Reginald, your husband, charged me on his deathbed to care for you. The estate gone, the house sold, you would have been left with nothing. I acted for you. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small vial, laudanum, half empty. I intended to take this myself once the snow cleared. A confession would have served no purpose. Mrs. Hargrove's voice broke. You foolish, foolish man! I would rather lose the house than have blood on my conscience. Miss Marple stepped forward and gently took the vial from Carver's unresisting hand. It is over, she said. The police will come soon. The true heir's claim will be settled honourably, and justice for Edward Hargrove, for Diana Bantry, and for George will be done. Lydia began to cry softly. Richard stared at Carver, as though seeing him for the first time. Miss Gregory removed her spectacles and wiped her eyes. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and water began to strip from the eaves, the first signs of thaw. In the great hall, the fire settled into embers, and the long shadows of the Hargrove portraits seemed, at last, to shorten. The culprit had been unveiled, not by dramatic accusation, but by the patient unravelling of small, unnoticed threads, the dust on a sleeve, the scrape on a floorboard, the tremor in a loyal hand. Miss Marple closed her notebook with a soft snap. Human nature, she reflected, was always the same. Only the snowfalls changed. Chapter 8. The Final Snowfall's Silence. The thaw came swiftly after the revelations in the Great Hall. By noon on Christmas Day, water dripped steadily from the icicles that fringed the eaves of Eldridge Manor, and narrow runnels of meltwater traced dark paths across the snow-covered lawns. The world, so long frozen in silence, began to stir again. Carver had been confined to his pantry under Richard's watchful eye, the vial of laudanum removed, and the door locked from the outside. He had offered no resistance. His confession seemed to have drained the last of his rigid self-control. He sat now on a straight-backed chair, staring at the flagstones, a man whose lifelong devotion had twisted into tragedy. George Bantry, informed at last of his wife's death and the true sequence of events, had wept hoarsely for an hour before exhaustion claimed him again. The doctor, when he finally arrived 2 days later, on skis borrowed from the village, pronounced that he would recover physically, though the emotional wounds would take longer to heal. Miss Marple spent the intervening time quietly. She walked in the gardens as the snow retreated, revealing sodden grass, and the first brave snowdrops pushing through the earth. She took tea with Mrs. Hargrove in the morning room, listening as her hostess spoke of plans for the future, settlement with the true heir, sale of outlying farms, perhaps the opening of the house to visitors in summer. "You have saved us from worse than financial ruin," Mrs. Hargrove said one afternoon, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Carver's loyalty, it blinded him, and poor Diana, she was never strong enough to bear the weight of George's schemes." "Human beings are frail creatures," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly. "We all carry secrets, and snowfalls, whether literal or metaphorical, bring them to light eventually." Richard and Lydia departed the day the drive became passable. Their farewells were brief and strained. Lydia's gaiety had vanished entirely. She looked pale and subdued in her furs. Richard shook Miss Marple's hand with military correctness. "I misjudged the situation badly," he admitted. "Debts and pride, dangerous combination. Aunt Eleanor has been more than generous. We shall manage somehow." Miss Gregory remained. She had received a letter, delivered by the postman who struggled through on the third day after the thaw, from the descendant of Edward Hargrove. It was courteous, restrained, expressing willingness to accept a fair settlement, and no wish to displace Mrs. Hargrove from the home she loved. "I think," Miss Gregory told Miss Marple, as they packed the last of the muniment papers, "that justice need not always be harsh. Edward's great-grandson only wants acknowledgement, not vengeance." Miss Marple smiled. "A wise young man. The past is done. We must live in the present." On the morning of her own departure, Miss Marple stood in the entrance hall with her modest suitcase. The great oak door stood open, revealing a world transformed. The snow reduced to patchy remnants in shaded corners. The sky a clear winter blue, rooks wheeling noisily over the bare oaks. Mrs. Hargrove came to see her off, the Daimler, freshly dug out, idled on the gravel. "You will come again?" she asked, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "If you wish it, my dear, though perhaps in summer, when the gardens are kinder." They both smiled at that. As the car pulled away down the long drive, Miss Marple looked back once. Eldridge Manor stood against the pale sky, its windows catching the sunlight like friendly eyes. Smoke rose gently from the chimneys, and she fancied she saw Miss Gregory waving from an upper window. The journey home was uneventful. The train ran again, the roads were clearing, and the world returned to its ordinary rhythms. In her compartment, Miss Marple took out her notebook and turned to the final page. She wrote neatly, "Case concluded. Motive, misplaced loyalty. Culprit, Carver, confessed. Victim, Diana Bantry, by manipulation. George Bantry, accessory to attempted fraud, survived. Resolution, settlement with lawful heir. Manor preserved for present generation." She paused, then added a personal reflection. "Snow covers much, but nothing forever. Human nature remains constant, capable of great devotion and great error. A peaceful Christmas, all things considered." She closed the book and watched the winter landscape slide past. Hedgerows dripping, fields emerging, the occasional flash of a snowdrop or early celandine. Back in St. Mary Mead, her little house welcomed her with its familiar comfort. The maid had kept the fires going. Letters awaited her on the hall table. The village gossips would soon call for news. That evening, as she sat by her own fireside with a cup of tea, Miss Marple reflected on the events at Eldridge Manor. A missing heir restored after 3 generations. A butler whose devotion became poison. A woman driven to despair by lies not her own. A family brought low, yet perhaps strengthened by truth. Outside her window, the last of the village snow was melting into the gutters. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented sigh. Another mystery resolved. Another reminder that beneath the polite surfaces of English life, passions ran as deep as ever. And somewhere, in a warmer climate, a man who bore the blood of the Hargroves would receive acknowledgment at last, while an old manor house in England prepared for a quieter, more honest future. The final snowfall had melted, taking its secrets with it. Only the snowdrops remained, pushing bravely through the cold earth, a promise that spring and renewal always follow winter's end.